Think tanks have always played a big role in Massachusetts politics, like the fiscally progressive Mass Budget and Policy Center or the conservative watchdog Pioneer Institute. But late last year, a new think tank arrived on the scene, the Boston Policy Institute, launched by a pair of longtime Democratic operatives. And this year, they made a big splash with a report that said declining commercial real estate values will pose a big financial problem for the city. That finding sparked an ongoing debate featuring Mayor Michelle Wu and a bunch of other more established parties like the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. It's also raised questions about who is funding the Boston Policy Institute and what the organization's ultimate goals are. I'm joined now by Commonwealth Beacon reporter Gin Dumcius, who recently dug into those questions in a story titled "The Shadowy Think Tank Fighting Boston City Hall." Gin, great to see you as always. So what do we know about the Boston Policy Institute and what don't we know?
Thanks for having me. So a couple of things. We know that, as you mentioned at the top, that these are two Democratic political consultants who've been around politics for quite some time. Maynard has worked in local elections in and around Boston, also in Worcester. And Joe Caiazzo has worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign, Sheldon Whitehouse in Rhode Island. So they've both been around. And what they've set up is a think tank. It's under the IRS designation 501c4, which allows them to essentially not disclose who their donors are. And I obtained a copy of a presentation they were shopping around before the 2023 elections, kind of hoping to set this up and bring that kind of scrutiny, fresh scrutiny to City Hall. And that lack of disclosure of donors was a key selling point in that presentation. What was the argument in favor of a lack of disclosure? Well, so when I talked to Maynard for the story, he said the blowback that he had seen from City Hall over their report about office values, to him that justified the secrecy there, and he also touched on something that for Boston City Hall has been known for decades. I mean, going back to the Menino years of mayors sometimes striking out or striking at folks who speak up. Mm-hmm. So that was his argument. Yeah, can you characterize their politics? You talked about the background of Joe Caiazzo and Greg Maynard. I think they, if I recall correctly, they might have met working on Elizabeth Warren's campaign. I hope I'm getting that right. But how would you characterize their politics? Are they centrist, liberal, progressive? If you had to label them, what would you do? Well, I kind of let people label themselves. I think that's probably the best way to go about it. I do think it's interesting. They did meet Michelle Wu on that Elizabeth Warren 2012 campaign, which I guess if you were working in Democratic politics in 2012, you probably were working on that campaign or at least involved in some way. And certainly, they've been in and around the same orbit in the years since the 2013 race to succeed Menino that Marty Walsh won. Maynard worked for both, I believe it was Dan Connolly and then John Connolly in the final election. So, in terms of the politics, I mean, you can take a look at how they're handling some of the analysis. I mean, in one case, they did ask back a couple of months ago an analyst from the Democrats for Education Reform to take a look at Boston Public Schools and whether it's how it's handling the memorandum of understanding with state education officials. So that might be one indication of where they're coming from. You and I were on a phone call this week in which the Boston Policy Institute was talking about a new poll that they just did with Social Sphere and John Della Volpe, the pollster, looking at issues facing the city. In that poll, they found that people really like the quality of life in Boston, but feel that on certain issues, the city isn't doing enough to do work that needs to be done. Affordable housing, cost of living, those are two examples. In that same call, the pollster shared some ratings that they had obtained for Mayor Michelle Wu that suggested that people thought pretty highly of the job that she was doing as mayor. But it turns out, apparently, based on our inability to get more detail on those numbers, that they were released inadvertently. Why might an organization poll something like that
but not put those numbers out there publicly along with all the other data that they put out?
Sure. I mean, it's a very good question. You know, and it's certainly, I think, as we saw that when the materials came out afterwards, that, you know, the details of those favorables were not there. You know, it's overall the poll was, you know, there was a lot for the mayor and her administration to like if they were going through all the crosstabs and everything. You know, I think it's one of those things of you know, did they want to focus more on policy versus you know, what could be described as horse race? I'm not sure. Could it be something to do with the, you know, designation through the IRS about kind of where the line is about getting involved in electioneering or campaigning? You know, I think that's kind of a mystery at this point. But you know, it did come out. You know, Della Volpe did say in response to a reporter's question, he delved right into it, and I think we all started scribbling very quickly.
Yeah, you and I know both thought that was the most important thing. So just a follow-up question, then we'll have to wrap up. I mean, I found myself wondering when they wouldn't put those numbers out, might the funding for BPI be coming from someone who is fundamentally antagonistic to the mayor or doesn't want to release information that might be seen as boosting her reelection prospects? That being said, there's been no ad hominem attacks on the mayor like you might get with other think tanks that might go after people in a highly personal way. They haven't been doing that with her. But if their information is right, do you think it matters if they have mysterious funding or a fundamentally critical slant vis-a-vis the mayor? If the data is good, is the data therefore able to stand on its own?
Well, I think I've been doing this for 15 plus years, and for me, it's always been more information is a good thing to know where everybody is coming from. Certainly, the data itself is important, but also, you know, who's presenting the data, I think, is a fair question. You know, them not disclosing the donors certainly opens up, you know, certainly to themselves up to whispers. I mean, that's been outside City Hall. There's been discussion of exactly, you know, are there potential rivals that are helping this effort? You know, certainly. You know, there's questions about whether, like, it's as I noted in my story, whether there's any sort of grudge match, because you know, Greg Maynard's wife used to work for Wu when she was a city councilor.
That's right. And then when those numbers were shared and then not fully shared, it just, for me, enhanced the questions that you just raised. So, again, Dumcius, thank you.
Thanks for having me.